Good morning, Liberty. It is Wednesday morning, April 24th, 2019. My name is Michael Bolden, broadcasting to you live from my home office and studio here in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. We are multicasting live through our channels at YouTube, Facebook, and Periscope, and D-Live as well. And, of course, we have the archives all over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/goodmorningliberty, where you can get video or podcast versions. I hope you're having a wonderful Wednesday morning, whether it's morning or afternoon or evening, whenever you happen to be tuning in. Thank you so much for joining me today. Now, today I want to do an episode. It's kind of a fun one for me because I just want to go over a top 5 list. I know BuzzFeed probably made these popular on social media, and a lot of them can be pretty irritating. So we did a few here. One of them, Mike Maharrey put together an article that cites a lot of other research that we've done and a lot of our work over the years called Top 5 Lies About Nullification. And I thought it was a good time to basically share my thoughts on these top 5 lies. Of course, I've done a number of episodes that covered some of these things in the past. We'll hear about the Supremacy Clause. We'll hear about Calhoun. We'll hear about Madison. We're going to hear about how, Rachel Maddow maybe. And I did an episode about Rachel just last week and how people use her talking points about nullification and slavery. They all get these wrong. But I don't want to give away all the top 5 lies that we hear regularly here over the years from both sides, but we'll get to that in a little bit. I do want to say hi to some friends out in the live chat over on YouTube. My buddy Alan Mosley with the Gold Standard Podcast says the shirt. There's Justin Bayola, EHP Training, Joe Standridge. On Facebook, R.C. Andrews, Shane Lackey, Dan Reed says, I put Tom Woods, Kevin Gutzman on pause just for you. No one else gets that. That's pretty awesome. Hi to Dennis Marburger, also noticing the shirt. For those of you, that's an inside joke. I wore this for some people who would get that. So if you don't get it, maybe I'll have to do a video about that sometime in the near future. So with that, let's get to today's episode. Top 5 lies about nullification. And I'm primarily going to be using an article from Mike Maharrey last December as the base resource on this. And we talk about all these various things in other episodes, but I've also got some ideas for a couple of new episodes, standalone episodes, to talk about various issues here as well. And this is how Mike starts out his article. And let me pull this up here. And I put this for the introduction for the show notes as well over on Facebook and YouTube. Plus, you can also see that again over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/Good Morning Liberty. He says, we hear them over and over and over again. The same tired, worn-out misconceptions or downright lies about nullification. Historians, legal scholars, and journalists all parrot these fallacies every time anybody proposes nullification. They use these misconceptions as a way to derail efforts to stop federal overreach and limit the power of the general government. Some of them sound plausible, especially if you were a product of government schools. But all of them are wrong. And I am a product of the government schools. And as I was coming of age, we'll say, as I was becoming more interested in things happening in the world around me, I thought the solution to every problem was government. So you go to a government school, and I also went to a Catholic school when I was in elementary school, but of course the schools have to be sanctioned by government. So most of us have gone to government-run or government-sanctioned schools, and I thought all the solutions to government problems were more government power. They just didn't have enough power or enough money. And so I understand and I can appreciate why there's so many people who believe that today, because we're indoctrinated on that level from the very early ages. And then when you have an intergenerational problem of this, it gets worse and worse and worse. So, of course, you hear these kind of, I don't know, comical, clownish views about nullification where people are talking about things that they've never studied, or they've only been spoon-fed one or two lines about it in these government schools, and then everybody else they talk to are saying the exact same things. Then, of course, it becomes the problem becomes compounded. And Bob Brewer, who's been supporting the show and watching for a long time over on YouTube, he took a little issue with me hammering on Chuck Woolery in my Rachel Maddow episode the other day. He basically was saying, I like him. He does a lot of good stuff, and he needs education. And I was giving Chuck a really hard time about this tweet he posted about nullification. It sounded exactly like Rachel Maddow. Nullification was used by the South, and they're racist, and it helped preserve slavery, and this is an absurd view. Now, maybe in his case, he just needs some education, or he's been surrounded by people who've had this kind of farcical, this nonsensical view of history, or this education on history. I don't know. But I just... let's get right to it, okay? Keith the Hat Guy over in the chat says, nullify everything, or almost. And Justin Bayola says, I was lucky to have a very good history teacher with a proper perspective on federal power. Not many are so fortunate. I had terrible history teachers. I had terrible education growing up. I was lucky enough that I was the youngest in my family, so for those of you who experienced that, and you've got a smart older siblings, I have an older brother and an older sister, you learn a lot from them. So you know a lot of things that you supposedly are going to be learning in school, you already know. So I was lucky in that situation. So I was always very inquisitive or bored, and I got into a lot of trouble as a kid. But I think that kind of carried forward to me as an adult, where although I had really bad textbook education in school, grade school, high school, and in college, I was still inquisitive. And I didn't like how things were around me, even though I was a Marxist, or I proudly proclaimed I was a Marxist, even if I wasn't. I don't think I would probably a really good one. But I definitely identified as one, or a socialist of some stripe. But because I was so inquisitive, I was looking for new teachers. I found Harry Brown. I found Tom Woods. I found Kevin Gutzman. I found many people. Rob Natelson is another guy who taught me a lot of things about the constitutional structure and real history, or at least taught me how to teach myself in many ways. And I think that goes back to the, you can teach a man, you can give a man fish, but if you teach him to fish, then he can be, I don't know, you guys get the saying, though. If you learn how to do something, you can take care of yourself. So I learned from many of these people and many others how to actually research this stuff for myself. That's not going to be the source of this conversation today, but let's get into some of these top 5 lies about nullification. The first one is always the Supremacy Clause. Supposedly, the Supremacy Clause prohibits nullification. And Mike writes in his article, this probably ranks as the most common nullification objection. According to the naysayers, the Constitution's Supremacy Clause makes every federal edict the supreme law of the land, and the states they can't do anything about it. Oh, all federal acts, when they conflict with state law, federal law always wins. We hear this over and over and over. We hear this from people in the grassroots. We hear this from political pundits. We hear this from attorneys. Now, we're going to be running a new article from Mike on Friday, and maybe I'll do a podcast about this as well. I'm assuming he's going to. But he's been working closely with a really, really good activist, one of our members in Illinois, who's focused primarily on surveillance and asset forfeiture and working to undermine both state and federal programs on on these two areas. And maybe he's going to work on other issues as well. But he has been working on getting a bill to refuse to provide resources to warrantless federal surveillance. And he had to go to the state Senate's attorney, like a drafting attorney for legislation. And maybe his own state senator is misdirecting him to go to this guy, but the guy is basically saying, and this is the attorney is basically saying, when federal and state law conflict, federal law always wins. And this is a mentality amongst the most educated on the law and the Constitution. And this is what has been propagated through our society, and it's totally wrong. Mike points out in his article, and I did an entire episode on this as well, only the Constitution and laws, quote, made in pursuance thereof qualify as supreme. So the only time federal law is supreme is when they're acting in accordance with the delegated powers of the Constitution. They can't just do anything they want. And Mike goes on, he says, any federal act not in pursuance of the Constitution is, as Alexander Hamilton put it, void. And Hamilton was the biggest government of the biggest government guys out there at the time. And even he was saying if they act outside these delegated powers, it's automatically void. I did an entire episode on this back in February called the Supremacy Clause Smackdown. This was February 13th, 2019. I've got it up on the screen for those of you who are watching video live or in the archive. If you're in the podcast and you want a link to this, you definitely just want to go over to 10thamendmentcenter.com/goodmorningliberty, where you can get the whole overview of the Supremacy Clause. And in that episode, I basically go through what the proposals were, because one of the most important things that we should study when we look at constitutional powers that the federal government has or doesn't have are things that were proposed and rejected at the Philadelphia Convention. So at that convention, they considered the Virginia Plan, basically the ability of the federal government to have a veto power over all acts of state governments, basically being supreme in everything. They considered this, and it was soundly rejected. The founders, the drafters of the Constitution at the Philadelphia Convention, did not want that in the Constitution. Total federal supremacy. They rejected it. So that means the ratification debates in the states, the ratifying conventions, the people of the several states, never even considered it as a possibility to approve the Constitution. Instead, they came up with the Supremacy Clause, which said only those acts which are in pursuance of the delegated powers of the Constitution. There's somewhere between 30 and 35, depending on how you count them. Most of them are in Article 1, Section 8. There's 18 there, if you include necessary and proper. So there's not a lot of power delegated to the federal government. James Madison famously in Federalist 45 said the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined, and those reserved to the states and the people are numerous and indefinite. So we know that this lie is nonsense. They're twisting the meaning of the Supremacy Clause. They're hoping that other people actually fall for it and haven't studied it. So that's the most common one that we hear. And we see this from legal experts, from constitutional scholars, from judges, all kind, maybe not judges. I don't know. Possibly. They're all pretty bad. So it wouldn't surprise me. They basically take this position that the federal government can do anything. Or what they do if they can't, if they say that the federal government is only limited to those delegated powers, then they want to expand the delegated powers to include everything. A judge that I think of on this one in some regards is Justice Scalia, the late judge from the Supreme Court. And when in a political position, as a conservative in the 90s when he opposed marijuana legalization going into 2005, the Gonzalez versus Raich case. Instead of saying that growing a plant in your backyard, consuming in your own home, never buying or selling it was not part of the Commerce Clause, they looked to expand that. So therefore, then federal law is supreme. So they have kind of a few tricks up their sleeves in this, and that's definitely a side note. So the top lie that we hear about nullification is that the Supremacy Clause makes every federal act supreme in every situation. Scott Lashua asks over in the live chat, just taking a quick look over on Facebook, what, in your opinion, is the best way to nullify a law? I actually should pull up a link to this, but I did an episode on the anti-commandeering doctrine. And there's also an entire episode about James Madison's advice. Maybe I can get back in the comments after the show and put you in touch with a link on this. Or if you want to, Scott, go to 10thamendmentcenter.com/report. This is our annual State of the Nullification Movement report that talks about the constitutional basis, the strategy that we employ in the first half of it. That's like 30 pages. And then the second half talks about how it's being implemented today. So that's a really good question. Samuel says, problem also is that a lot of people stop learning history and politics in high school. And I think that's part of where I was lucky. I don't think I'm better or worse than anybody. I just happen to be pissed off about what I saw in the world around me. At the time, I was pissed off about war. I still am. But I also was mad that the federal government didn't own more things. I wanted the government, every time they did a bailout, to actually own the businesses that they were bailing out. So I was mad about that too. And I thought, like Michael Moore, in the 90s, pointing out that people on the left and the right were the same. This was before he was totally a partisan hack, just a consistent socialist at the time, I guess. Justin Bayola says that's a great maxim. Jess from Vermont, good to see you here on YouTube. And hi to Tyler, Cameron, Bill, Jim, and RC. I think I already saw RC. RC says, this is a good question as well. How is it that Hamilton had this opinion but was for all for the president appointing governors? Well, so Hamilton is an interesting case here. And I like to cite Hamilton when he says the right thing. And in the debates, in the ratification debates, for example, in New York, he said a lot of the right things. In the Federalist Papers, obviously, he was one of the three main authors, two main ones, because John Jay was really out of there early on. But between him, Madison, and Jay, wrote a lot of good things from the Federalist perspective so we can understand where they're coming from. But I know that Hamilton was a shifty POS, real piece of garbage in that he would often in the New York ratifying convention say things to placate the opponents, knowing full well that he was going to work as hard as possible to shift things around later on. So his goal was to be a monarchist, have a central power where, who was that again? That was RC, who wanted to have a central government that even appointed the governors of the states, made them totally dependent on the central government. Great question on that as well. So the second lie that we hear is that John C. Calhoun invented nullification. Now, we could get into the weeds about Calhoun, his good positions, his bad ones. That's not even the point here. The comic book version that we hear from opponents is that Calhoun invented nullification. It was never heard of before then. It was only started at the time that Calhoun came out with this idea, and it's never been tried since. And in fact, I actually cited someone in my episode on the 19th. Here, I'm pulling it up on the video here. They all sound like Rachel Maddow on nullification. That was our Good Morning Liberty episode on the 19th of this month. And I'm not sure if it was Dick Morris or Jeff Sessions or John Bolton. It wasn't Chuck Woolery, but one of these right-winger guys, pseudo-neocon establishment folks, basically was taking the position that nullification started with Calhoun and has never been tried since. And it's only rearing its ugly head again today against the Trump administration. Now, when Maddow was attacking us, if you haven't seen that full episode, it was a fun one for me. Now, when Maddow was attacking us because we were trying to nullify Obamacare and Obama's gun control, and we're still working on those things. Obamacare is still around, and Obama's gun control is actually getting worse under the Trump administration, so we're working to nullify these things. It doesn't matter who's in power. but these partisan hacks on the left and right only oppose our work based on who's in power. Then again, there's a few that are consistent. Think Progress on the left, Mark Levin on the right consistently oppose this view of resisting and undermining federal power through nullification. So they were basically saying, look, it started. It was invented there. And Maddow, in her 14-minute segment on MSNBC a few years ago, back I think it was 2011, she compared our efforts at the 10th Amendment Center specifically with John C. Calhoun. And the reason that they do this is because if you're just doing quick talking points and your audience isn't educated, you can immediately point to, well, Calhoun was in support of slavery. So therefore, if it starts with Calhoun, you must be there to do it in support of slavery. And that's how they want to actually frame the discussion. If you support nullification, you're a racist, you're a neo-Confederate, you support slavery, you're a white supremacist, and you hate America. And we've heard this from both sides of the political spectrum, the establishment pundits and politicians on both sides. And this is how Meharry put it in his article back in December. Virtually every mainstream article about nullification invokes the name John C. Calhoun. Most of them will assert that he came up with the idea for state nullification. This, of course, is meant to tie the principles of nullification to slavery, as the South Carolina senator was an unapologetic supporter of the institution. I didn't know that. I actually haven't studied Calhoun on slavery at all, so that could be the case. I'm going to trust Mike on that. But he goes on and he says, it's true that Calhoun was a central figure in the so-called nullification crisis in the 1820s and 30s, but this had nothing to do with slavery, and he did not come up with the idea of nullification. So Calhoun didn't invent this idea. What he was doing was he was trying to implement what Thomas Jefferson recommended in the Kentucky Resolutions of 1798 and the Virginia Resolutions of 1798 written by James Madison. These were passed in response to the Alien and Sedition Acts, primarily an attack on free speech. And here's what Jefferson put it. They were enacted by President Adams in 1798, and this is how Mike wrote. He said they were clear violations of the Due Process Clause, the First Amendment, and the 10th Amendment. Jefferson and Madison both insisted a state had both a right and duty to step in and stop the overreach. It was Jefferson who insisted that nullification is, quote, the rightful remedy. Whensoever the general government assumes undelegated powers, Jefferson wrote, its acts are unauthoritative, void, and of no force. And he also wrote in his original draft for 1798 that nullification is the rightful remedy to deal with this anytime. Not after you try to vote the bums out, not after you go to a federal court and lose, not after you lobby them, not after all of this stuff. It's the rightful remedy as soon as they violate the Constitution, as soon as they assume undelegated powers, according to Thomas Jefferson. That's not my words. I'm just repeating Jefferson. Now, of course, people who oppose this, if they like Jefferson in some regards, all of a sudden they'll call him a wackadoo. And that's an actual quote from Esquire magazine a few years ago, I think 2012 or 2013, when they were attacking our work there. They just said, well, Jefferson was a bit of a wackadoo, so we're going to discard this view of that. So Meharry goes on, and he quotes Jefferson here, who says, where powers are assumed which have not been delegated, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy, that every state has a natural right. This isn't a constitutional right. You don't get this right from the 10th Amendment. And when we're talking about states, we're talking about the people of the state, of each of the several states. They have a natural right. It's an extra constitutional. It's beyond the Constitution. You don't have to look to a document to give you permission to do this. You just do it based on the lines in the sand drawn by the Constitution saying you're allowed to do this, Washington, D.C., and when you go beyond that, we're going to exercise our rights. This is our right as a people. Every state has a natural right, Jefferson wrote, in cases not within the compact to nullify of their own authority all assumptions of power by others within their limits. They don't have to wait for someone else to give them permission. They're nullifying of their own authority. And of course, I did the episode, I guess that's just last week, pulling up the link to that if you want to hear more about this kind of a talking point about Calhoun, slavery. They all sound like Rachel Maddow on nullification. Again, the link's in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/, Good morning, Liberty. Over in the chat, Bill Frankel says Hamilton was a big proponent of central banks as well. Yes. Harley points out, still rocking the shirt. It's been a while since I've popped this one out. Joseph Karen says, if Maddow attacks you, you're probably doing the best thing. And I'm going to do a video at some point where it just gives all the one-star reviews of the bad, of the attacks about how bad we are from left and right establishment. We're bad. We're evil. We were attacked by a former Bush administration kind of defense official saying we were part of the ACLU wing of the Tea Party. They wrote about this in the Wall Street Journal in like 2013, 2014, because we were opposing indefinite detention under the National Defense Authorization Act of 2012. So they don't like us anytime we oppose centralized power. Dan Reed, this is awesome. Listen to Dan's podcast, The Culinary Libertarian, which is really fun. Once I was a guest on it a little while ago, I subscribed in iTunes and I really enjoy it. So he says wackadoo, technical term. So that's exactly what they called it. So let's get over back to the top 5 lies. The third one is that, and this one at least uses a little bit more thought and history, so I can appreciate where this one comes from. But they say James Madison opposed nullification. This is for the people who are actually doing some research. They'll come across some articles that Madison wrote in response to the nullification crisis. The problem is, and here's how Mike puts it in his article, quote, they rely on arguments Madison made during the aforementioned nullification crisis, but they take his comments out of context. Now, we all see people put quotes out, memes and things like that. And this is a very common thing. Generally, it's because the person hasn't honestly looked at the rest of it. You can read a letter, and if you don't understand the context, then you can be taken in the wrong direction. Or if you don't understand definitions of the word at the time, I've often talked about post roads. Under the Constitution, the federal government has the power to basically establish and regulate post roads, but people think that means every road over which the mail is carried, when in fact, what the founders understood it to mean in the legal document, the Constitution, are roads that had post markers every mile or so, basically mile markers. So this would be like the interstate highway system, not every local road. The federal government does not have authority over that. So you can really get pushed in the wrong direction when you don't understand context or you don't understand the meaning of the terms that are being used at the time. So Madison did write a series of letters, or it's called Madison's Notes on Nullification. And he was pretty old at the time, and some people tell you, oh, he was just a flip-flopper. But I think Madison was actually pretty consistent. He basically took the position that to do what he was asked to do. People asked him, hey, there's this proposal coming out of South Carolina, primarily from Upshur, Calhoun, etc. What do you think of it? And so Madison responded to the specific proposal. And that's how Mike puts it in this article. He said, Madison opposed a specific nullification scheme developed by Senator John C. Calhoun. He never renounced the general principles. Never. Calhoun took the general principles outlined by Jefferson and Madison. Now, it didn't start with Jefferson and Madison either, and I think this is its own episode at some point in the future. We do need to do more commentary about this, maybe some articles. But the principles that they talk about go all the way back to the Stamp Act, to the Virginia Resolves from Patrick Henry, talking about, and John Adams in court, talking about how when the federal government does, or when the government does stuff it's not supposed to do, you are not bound to obey them. And this was repeated over and over by people all across the political spectrum, at least on the American side. The founders, the revolutionaries, understood this general principle. And so in 1798, Jefferson and Madison formalized these principles of nullification and interposition in those resolutions. So Calhoun took this process and so Jefferson didn't actually come up with a specific process. So I know there was the question, how do you do this? How do you put this into practice? A little bit earlier, I forget who asked that. I think it was Scott. Yeah, Scott Lashua. And Jefferson, in that resolution, he didn't say how you nullify. He just said, you got to do this. And in fact, in a letter to James Madison after the Kentucky resolutions passed, before the Virginia resolutions were passed, he sent him a copy of it. He said, here's a copy of the of the Kentucky Resolves. We should hold to all their principles that they contain, and I'm just paraphrasing. But as far as strategy, we should, quote, push as far as events will render prudent. So he was leaving the strategy end of it, how to implement it, open to events. You don't know how things are going to play out, and always going, balls to the wall, full force on everything doesn't always work. Football fans, if you're always doing a blitz, sooner or later you're going to get burned, right? So you don't always go full forward, full speed ahead, because it doesn't always work. So Jefferson said, espouse the principles, but take steps that will work the best. So he didn't actually come up with a specific implementation. So where Madison was opposing Calhoun on this was his specific implementation of it. Basically, he was saying that, here's how Mike put it. Calhoun built on the ideas outlined in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions and claimed that if a single state nullified a federal act, it was annulled within that state, and it legally bound other states to honor its action until 3/4 of them overruled the nullification. Short version, it gave the power of one state, a member of the compact, the ability to annul things, to bind action of other states. When in reality, if a single state nullifying of their own authority, like Thomas Jefferson had to say, if they're nullifying of their own authority, they don't need the other states to approve them. Strategically, if the other states don't approve them, their chance of success is almost zero. If they don't get support from elsewhere, they're not going to succeed, most likely, in the long run. But when they do get support, it's better. So they're basically saying that the federal government is bound by the single action of a state, that the other states have to come into a convention. Madison just opposed this process. He said this specific process, and he kept referring to it in these notes on nullification that Mark Levin has repeatedly, consistently cited. Same with Think Progress, same with Heritage Foundation, and maybe even Steve Bannon, Rachel Maddow's, maybe former producer over at MSNBC. I'm not sure, but he used to talk about this as well. Madison opposed this, so of course you can't do it. And Madison specifically talked about this. He talked about it, how it was this specific doctrine, and he called it the doctrine of South Carolina. So if you're reading it out of context and you're like, oh, okay, this nullification is going to destroy the fabric of the Union. No, he was saying the proposal from South Carolina he opposed. Now, you can be supportive of Calhoun's, but know that Madison opposed it. But to say that Madison opposed all nullification all the time in all of its forms and all of its strategies is a total lie. It's reading it out of context. It's either ignorant or lying. And here's how Madison put it. It's a pretty long quote, but I'll read it here. Thus, the right of nullification meant by Mr. Jefferson is the natural right which all admit to be a remedy against insupportable oppression. James Madison there says everyone, all the founders admitted that this is a remedy against insupportable oppression. Now, Jefferson had a happier trigger finger on this. He said, whensoever the federal government assumes undelegated power. So any undelegated power, Jefferson said, nullification is the rightful remedy. Madison, in his later years, I think, was more pragmatic and said, look, when it's insupportable oppression, let's go through the other process. And if it gets really, really bad, then, of course, this is a natural right, which we all agreed is a remedy to this. Now he goes on, though. He says, it cannot be supposed for a moment that Mr. Jefferson would not revolt at the doctrine of South Carolina, that a single state could constitutionally resist a law of the Union while remaining within it, and that with the accession of a small minority of the others, overrule the will of a great majority of the whole and constitutionally annul the law everywhere. So he's basically talking about, now you could agree with South Carolina. Madison did not, and he's telling us that he believes that Jefferson did not. So it's a very specific thing that Madison's notes on nullification was talking about. The fourth lie is that the Supreme Court decides constitutionality, that it's only the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is the total final arbiter of everything. We're ruled by 9 unelected, unaccountable, politically connected lawyers that wear dresses for life on the bench. You can tell I don't have a lot of respect for them because I think they've been a serious part of the problem for decades. So Mike writes, even if they admit that federal actions violating the Constitution have no legal force, modern pundits will always claim that it's the Supreme Court's job to determine the constitutionality of an act, not a state. They will usually refer to John Marshall's famous opinion in Marbury versus Madison to bolster their case. Oh, I forgot. On the previous lie on Madison, Meharry wrote an entire book on this, a short booklet. It's like 36 pages called Smashing Myths, Understanding Madison's Notes on Nullification. I gave the short version of that, but if you ever want to read about this, we sell it for $9. The link is in the show notes, 10thamendmentcenter.com/goodmorningliberty. I should never forget to do my promotional work here as well, because the financial support means a lot to us. It really, even if it's just a few bucks, it helps us get the work done. So this fourth one, they say John Marshall tells us in Marbury versus Madison that only Supreme Court gets to take an opinion on this. So Mike goes on, he says, in effect, these people argue that the federal government determines the power of the federal government. And Jefferson pointed out the absurdity of this notion in the Kentucky resolutions. He wrote, quote, the government created by this compact was not made the exclusive or final judge of the extent of the powers delegated to itself. And as Tom Woods has put it in a number of nullification speeches over the years, and I think Jefferson and Madison, he said basically, Jefferson, Madison warned us that if the federal government could determine the extent of its own powers, you shouldn't be surprised when those powers grow and grow and grow, no matter what party is in power, no matter how many lawsuits, no matter how many times you vote the bums out, that power will always grow as long as the federal government determines the extent of its own powers. Jefferson wasn't the only one. Madison, father of the Constitution in the Report of 1800, Mike writes, also insisted that the Supreme Court only had the final say in a dispute between the three branches of the government, but not in a dispute over federal power in relation to the states. And as far as Marshall's opinion in Marbury, most people actually get that totally wrong. I do have it in my notes to do an episode about Marbury versus Madison, because I think most people get that one wrong. And then the last one that I'm going to cover here as well, nullification supported slavery. And this is a very, very common one. I did an episode, I'm pulling it up on the screen here for those of you who are watching, Nullification versus the Fugitive Slave Act. This is an entire episode that I did on March 25th. Again, links in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/goodmorningliberty. An entire episode talking about how northern states and abolitionists, people like John Greenleaf Whittier, for example, William Lloyd Garrison, these are people who were anti-slavery, using nullification, supporting nullification against the Federal Fugitive Slave Act, a pro-slavery law of 1850. They also used it for 25 years against the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. So it is absurd to claim that nullification was used to support slavery. They never had to. Mike puts it this way. Nullification was never used to support slavery. Slavery was the law of the land, according to the federal government. There was nothing for the slavers to nullify. So I hope you found this interesting. It's really educational. These are the types of things we hear over and over and over. I do have a few other episodes that I need to do on this, maybe something on Madison's Report of 1800, on the Supreme Court, maybe Madison's Notes on Nullification. That could be an entire episode on its own to go into more detail on what was going on at that time, the nullification crisis and the real nullification crisis, which I think happened up in Vermont in 1850 in regards to the Fugitive Slave Act, because the federal government was talking about invading in 1850 as well. So that's its own episode as well. Again, Marbury versus Madison, and a few other things. Anyways, I hope you found this really interesting, insightful, fun to watch, educational. If you like the show, make sure to take 3 free, easy-to-do actions. All of the platforms you watch or listen on are very easily triggered. And so when you do things like this, it'll trigger their algorithm, and it'll be more likely that they'll show the program to more people. So smash the like button. leave some comments, even if it's later on in the archives, and share the link. Or if you're on iTunes, leaving a review. I don't want to beg everybody to do this, but all that stuff really helps a lot. And of course, if you want to contribute financially, $2 a month is where our membership program starts. 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I really appreciate you joining me today. I'm very grateful for you spending some time and wanting to listen. And I'll see you next time here on Good Morning Liberty. Have a great day.